Okay, just want to cover a couple of things first off in the presentations, and then want to explain a little bit more about our project that you're working on. First off, on the headlining coding, the 1-24-3, I think that's probably not used as much anymore as it used to be, because we particularly used it when somebody would actually design the whole page and give it to somebody else to produce. And that isn't done as much anymore. Because of desktop publishing, we are typically the person who is writing the headline is also deciding, is designing the page. That isn't universally true, but I mentioned, at least before things started to collapse in the newspaper industry, there were more than 10,000 newspapers in America. And I would say the ones who can afford to have somebody just design a page and hand it to somebody else to produce is not more than 200 newspapers at the most out of 10,000. And so most jobs in America, you're going to see the editors doing more of it. And especially with desktop publishing, there's not, if you're going to design your own, then you don't need to write a note as to how many columns wide and stuff. You might do it yourself, as I'm asking you to do, or suggested you to do, that you might want to just take a blank sheet of paper and very quickly kind of make a decision, look at your stories, look at your photos, and kind of very quickly draw out how you'd like your page to look. Very informally, don't be very precise. Now, in the old days, we had to be very precise. Because as I said, if we wrote a headline, the reason why we had that code is when we wrote a headline, the people in the back shop who actually put it together would just get one long strip of a headline and one long strip of a story. And so they had to have a very specific layout and understand, okay, I've got this long headline, what am I supposed to do with it? And so we had to tell them, this is to be the one column headline. We'd put a slug on the story so he could associate the headline with the story. So this one is one column, you're supposed to be 4 lines deep. So he would understand how to put it together. Now, as I said, with desktop publishing, there's no reason for there's no back shop anymore. Very few newspapers have a back shop to put things together. In those days, as I said, they'd have the long strips, and they would put it through a waxer, a hot waxer that would have would put hot wax in the back of all these strips of type. And like I say, they would paste up the page and make it look like it's supposed to look. Then they go into a dark room, they take a photo of it, and make it negative. Then they put the negative against a metal. Anyway, they create a plate out of it. I won't go into the details. So it's a totally different world now with desktop publishing. And I don't think I'd say there's, out of the whole world, probably, if there's anybody still drawing it out and having a back shop put it together, you're talking about maybe 1% of the newspapers in the world might still do that. I don't even know that it would be that much, because they'd be idiots to do it that way. Desktop publishing saves them so much time and so forth that, and there's even freeware, or very cheap desktop publishing. Last year when I taught this class, we didn't have Quark, and so I found a freeware to teach it with. The freeware was actually patterned a lot after Quark, but it's a lot slower, wasn't as good a program. There's no excuse for anybody not to use desktop publishing now except laziness and stupidity, one or the other. Or maybe not stupidity, but at least ignorance. So somebody who has no idea of anything of the modern world of journalism starts a newspaper and doesn't know what they're doing, possibly. Anyway, so those codes are hardly needed anymore if you are the editor who is designing the page and headlining the page and doing it all in desktop publishing. There's no reason to write out the codes. So I don't think you're not going to see that very much. In a large newspaper, as I said, you might have the luxury of hiring somebody who's just a design editor, and so he will design a page and hand it off to a copy editor and say, here, make it like this. There's pros and cons to that, in the sense that design editors are design editors because they're good at design. but sometimes they end up handcuffing you a little bit, and it ends up making the job more difficult and more time consuming because two people are handling that page. Whereas if you're doing it on your own, then you make decisions as you go along. You go by certain principles, like the principles I have in our critique sheet are principles of design. And if you know those principles, then you should do a pretty good job in your design. Okay, looking at the other thing I was going to mention then, it talks about points and picas. Didn't cover it. I think all the presenters talked about it, but it probably didn't mean anything to any of you, except I have talked about points. And points are used universally, even in Word and everything else, about size of headlines. And so as you go up, the bigger the headline, obviously. And I mentioned already in class, 72 points is 1 inch in American measurements. It also can equate to picas. Picas are not as... I'd say a lot of newspapermen nowadays don't know what a pica is. They don't really need to know what a pica is anymore. So I not to say you shouldn't be aware that it is a rule of measurement within the print industry, but I'd say most journalists don't know what a pica is. I do, because I started in the old days and I had to know picas. Points are another thing. You need to understand points. In fact, somebody who was teaching this concept yesterday did an example and said 1-6-4. Why is that crazy? Anybody understand the presentation well enough to understand why 1-6-4 would make no sense? 1 meaning what? What's the 1 represent? That's the column. Okay, 1 column wide. 6 represents the size. So how big is a 6-point headline? 6-point headline is the smallest size of type that you'll use in a newspaper. It's not a headline. It is actually, probably you won't ever use 6-point. It's something you might put in an ad that you don't really want people to read. Something the smallest type in an ad, you might make 6 points. So to say 1-6-4, 4 is how many lines of text, makes no sense. That's not a headline. That's, like I say, 6-point is, none of you will use 6-point in your work here. It's too small. So you actually have to understand what it means and, before you can make much meaning out of it. The other thing was there seems to be a changing definition of headlines. I know I define headlines differently than most textbooks in the sense that I explained to you before. When I say a what headline, I'm meaning what will come to the start of the sentence. And so what I'm trying to teach you in my textbook is that you can change your sentence in such a way to give emphasis grammatically to the 5 W's, to any of the 5 W's. And so, an example is, just inches from freedom, a soldier was killed. So that the answer, the first part of that sentence, what is the 5W covers is inches from freedom. So that's where are you at? And so that's my main purpose in naming it by the 5 W's is to show you how you can manipulate the words to emphasize different aspects. A lot of this textbook refers to what lead in a different way. Don't be confused, and if you see it on a test, it's probably going to be my definition, okay? It almost certainly will, because I already have those questions written out. So I'm going to use the ones that I've already have written out. So go by the crash course when it comes to headline definitions. And it appears that another thing that isn't a conflict, wasn't a conflict that I created, let me put it that way, is the difference between a delayed identification by my book and the delayed identification by this book, a lead. I took mine from another textbook, a very popular textbook by a writer named Huff. And he contrasts blind lead from delayed identification lead. And apparently is a direct conflict with this textbook. I adopted the one from Huff. So it wasn't my decision what to be called blind or delayed identification. I used his. And to him, first off, a blind lead is a lead that does not have a person's name. That seems to be what they're calling a delayed identification. So it doesn't have a person's name, but it may have a description of them. So that's a blind lead. It had no name, but a description. However, delayed identification then by Huff, and it seems to be in conflict with what they're saying here, is delayed identification is you might go ahead and put their name in the lead, but you tell who they are, give information about them in the second paragraph perhaps. So that seems to be the definitions by different textbooks, not just my textbook, seem to be conflicting a little bit. So again, go by mine. So a lead that has a description of a person in the lead but not, or it might even be their title but not their name, would be a blind lead. And a delayed identification, the identification by Huff, by this other writer, was what, actually explained who he is. That's what he means by identification. And so that would, so again, the blind lead would be the description of him, but not a name. The delayed identification would be the name, but not the description of who he is. That would be delayed. Okay. Just wanted to help clarify that, because especially when you get down to the final exam, go by my textbook. If there's a conflict, go by mine. Okay, I went ahead and finished this, and I put a video on my on Moodle of my finishing this entire project. I ended up taking a little bit longer with the second part, maybe because it was late at night and I was getting tired. And also I had all the fine tuning. I wanted to make sure you understood everything that you could possibly not understand at that point. Let me explain those things that I did not explain in the lecture on Monday. In the lecture on Monday, I ended up, we did not have the stories on the right two columns done. I think we pretty much had stories 1, 2, and 3, the top one and the football one, and the runner down the lower left done. But we did not have these last two that I started, but I didn't finish them. And then, but one of the things I was doing, I believe, when we left off, was I was drawing text boxes out to the side and jumping the stories or linking the stories from the what I had fit into the page with that which I could not fit in the page. There are a couple of reasons why I do that, and I suggest that as a good practice. One is to know how much more do I have left. If I don't have very much left, I might as well just end the story on page 1. Or if you're still going to end the story on page 1, in our newspaper, in the daily newspaper I worked at, we had a rule that we could not, I think our maximum was jumping 3 stories to page 2. And we always had 6 stories on the front page. Could jump 2, or 3, I mean, was maximum. So in other words, we had no choice but to end 3 of our 6 stories on page 1. So it would be nice, it's nice to see what you have left, to see, even though most stories are written in inverted pyramid, and what I tell you about inverted pyramid, that makes it easy for an editor to just cut when you're done. You cut at the end of a sentence and you stop. Well, that's true and not true. I mean, if you actually have control of the whole paper and you're making that cut, you may want to see what's left in that story just to make sure that you can just cut at the end of any sentence and feel like it's adequately covered. Maybe that writer did not write in true inverted pyramid. Maybe there is some information you think is really important at the end of that story that maybe you need to bring up. And so as you're actually doing the cut, it's nice to know what's left before you make that cut. So that's one reason, those are a couple of reasons to do it. And then, of course, once you decide, okay, I am going to jump this story, then you see how much jump you have, how much story do you have left to put onto page 2. Now, I went ahead and jumped 4 stories, I was going to jump all of them. I thought I had enough to jump all, but when I got down to this runner story, it was only like one line left. So that it actually demonstrated the point that I thought there was more of this story, and there was only one line. So there's no way I was going to make a jump for one line. So I did cut that. I actually didn't have to cut the story. I was able to combine some paragraphs, which actually made fewer lines of type, and did away with it without cutting anything. Plus, I didn't have a cut line or a jump line anymore, so I got rid of the jump line, and I was able to make it all onto the page. I'm going to go down to demonstrate one thing that I wanted to point out. So down here, this is page 2. So let's pretend that this is a story that I'm doing on page 1, just for the argument's sake, so you understand again what I'm talking about. I'm going to reduce this text box, and so I see by this red X that there's more story. That's what the red X means. There's more story. It's sometimes not really true. Like there's a red X up here, and it's only apparently some extras. Somebody hit enter a few times. So there's not really more story in this one up here under the football one. Although it says there is, there isn't. But this one there is. And so again, to demonstrate my point, I'm creating another text box out here in order to link them and see how much is left. Now again, imagine this is on page 1. It's not on page 1, but imagine it is. And so I have this 3-column story. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control 1 to bring this up so you can see it. And so I've got this 3-column story, and I'll go ahead and bring this text box up so we can see it a little better. And I'm going to hit the link button here, the third button down from the top of this toolbar. I'll hit link. Now I click the button, the text box that I want to link from, and I then click on the one that I want to link to. And we see there's not a lot here. Let me go ahead and shrink it a little bit, though. I'm going to hit Control 0 again a second and just bring it in so we can see it all a little better. Okay, so if we were doing this, if we were actually on page 1, now what? Let's say I've totally finished page 1, I put a jump line in, and this is how much I've left, and it's in another text box. What do I do with this text box now? What I did was I just dragged the text box down to page 2. Now you can actually put your second box on page 2 and link them from page 1 to page 2 very literally and precisely. But if I'm going to draw text boxes out in the what they call this, the pasteboard is what they call this sometimes, out on the side, that's not part of your newspaper, and it's not actually going to be printed. I can go ahead and now drag this extra text box wherever I want it. So I can, if we can pretend this was page 1 and the first page is page 2, I can go to Control 0, and I can just go ahead and go on up and press against the ruler, and it will take me up here. So I can now, so basically the story is now jumping from here up to here, and I can put this onto the page and start my jump page. So if I had a page 3, I'd put it on page 3, obviously. So if you do what I did and draw your text boxes out next to the page 1 boxes, then you can just drag them down into page 2 and plop them in there, and then put them together, write the headlines and everything that way. Again, another way of doing it is to draw the box in page 2. In fact, let me go ahead and let me make another point here. I'm going to go ahead and expand this box again, so there's nothing in this box. I'm going to kill this box. Okay, so even though I put it down here before, I can put it on another page. If I want to, I don't want to add another page to it, but let's reverse the role here. And here's a text box up here I'd drawn earlier. I can link this one on page 2 to page 1, up to that box. So I can click on this, and I would click on the link box first, click on this page here, and then go up, and wherever that other page is, it can be in another, or this other text box, it can be in another page, any other page. It doesn't have to be even page, it doesn't have to be page 2, it can be page 8. So you can, if you have 8 pages all set up, you can jump from page 1 and go back to page 8 and click on a text box and page 8. I didn't shrink this one, so there's a link here. Even though there's no text here, there is a link here. And so I can just go, if I manipulate this box for some reason, it's going to go up here because they're linked together. Now that's the other thing I guess I want you to understand is why I will definitely check your links. And it's very easy for me to check. For example, if I want to check to see if this mountain story is linked, truly linked to page 1, all I have to do is go to my text tool, click into this text box here, hit Control A, and if I go to hit Control 1 now so I can see it, this is all, it's kind of light for you to see, but it's all selected. And if I go up to page 1, it's all selected too. And which is the key, that's the point of being linked. And so if I decide after I've already created page 2 or started creating page 2, I decide, you know, I should put a poll. This page 1 looks kind of dry over here, kind of dead in this one area. I need to put in another little photo or a pull-out quote or something. You do that, and you're going to push more text over to page 2. Okay, but it does it automatically. If they're not linked, I've had students try to avoid learning how to link their boxes, even though it's very simple. In the past, they're still in their final exam. I catch them. Not only do I check it myself like this, but sometimes it's so obvious and stupid. Even if I have only a PDF, I can tell they did it because they did the classic mistake. They ended up their last sentence on page 1 does not end up the same where it should be on page 2. In other words, they don't have some text. Some text is missing there because what they tried to do was cut the story on page 1 and go paste it into page 2. But then something happened and they didn't finish the story on page 1. Therefore, they're missing a sentence or so of text. So you absolutely have to learn how to link text boxes. And I will absolutely guarantee I check every text box to make sure they're linked. So you're not going to get away without linking them because it's just too important. So learn how to do it. I demonstrated it at least 4 times because I jumped 4 stories. And actually, I think I demonstrated it 5 times because I end up showing it on the 5th story and then deleting, and not jumping it. So I demonstrate it many times. You should be able to watch the videos and figure out how to do this. Now, going to page 2, some other points I want to make. I consider best practices to have a totally new headline on page 2. Okay, everybody needs to hear this because, for one thing, well, 2 things I want to point out. First off, headlining is worth 25% of your grade. You need to be really careful with your headlines. Make sure they're grammatically correct. Make sure they're written the way that it was taught in this PowerPoint today and that I taught. Past events and present tense verbs and so forth. If you don't do them right, you're going to lose a bunch of points because it's 25% of your grade. I don't know how to emphasize it any more than that. But in other words, you're going to write, well, on the front page, you might write 10 headlines in the sense of 10 main heads or rather 5 main heads and 5 subheadlines, possibly. I did not write a subheadline for one of my stories because I didn't have enough space. I didn't think it made sense to put a headline in when I didn't have hardly any room on page 1. On a page 2, I only require one headline. I don't suggest on jumps that you do a subheadline unless you want to for some reason, and you have a lot of jump, possibly. And so you're going to end up writing maybe maximum 15 kind of sentences. They're not really sentences, but headlines, like a sentence in a sense. And 25% of your grade will come from that. And so those 15, sentences or 15 headlines are worth 25% of your grade. If you do a bad job with them, if they're stupid, if they're too vague, if they're done improperly in grammar and so forth, check, 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 off goes points. So you need to review the rules of headlining on the critique sheet. It goes into quite a bit of detail. I made a slight revision in the critique sheet previously, and I reposted it yesterday. You might take a look at the revised version. It didn't revise a lot. The only thing was actually what I said on Monday was that I on a broadsheet, I'm going to allow you to go 2 lines of headline for the main headline across 4 columns. Not 5 or 6, but across 4, I'll let you go 2 lines. Because it's, in a tabloid, the maximum is 3 columns, you can go 2 lines. But once you go to 4 lines, it's only 1 line. But that's a smaller page, and so I think they should be treated somewhat differently. And so with the broadsheet, I say you can go 2 lines with a 4-column headline, which you cannot do in the tabloid, by my rules anyway. Again, coming back to this new headline, you'll notice my headline, if I go up to page 1, I'm holding down the Alt button so I can drag it up. Here's my headline for the hiking story. TMEP alumnus establishes new hiking club for community. You notice this is where I did not have a subheadline because I had so little story up here. I couldn't see putting a subheadline in there and not have any story. On page 2, I looked for something in the page 2 text to write a headline about, and that, I believe, is part of the best practices. So a new headline written based on what's on page 2. And so I started looking at the story, and the person being quoted in page 2 was talking a lot about how climbing in the mountains made her feel so much better, so more positive, and so forth. And so that's what I based my headline on. Hikers feel positive vibes from mountains. And that's what hooked me to this technique, and why I call it best practices, is I was competing against the daily newspaper I used to work for. I became their competitor, and I started a weekly newspaper to compete with them. And so they were doing everything they could to put me out of business, because that's their job, is to keep a monopoly in the market. And I noticed that they were doing this. They were putting new headlines on their jump pages. And I found myself frequently reading page 2 when I did not read page 1 of their story, because their main headline did not attract my interest. But I saw on page 2 their headlines did attract my interest. And consistently, when I went to page 2, I found what they were headlining on page 2 on page 2. I'd read that. Sometimes I go back to page 1 and start the story over again, now being convinced it's worth to reading. But I actually did go backwards on this thing frequently, found myself attracted to a page 2 headline that was not on page 1, that did not attract me in page 1. And it was, again, they were basing their page 2 headline on text on page 2. I would find that text, and sometimes that's all I would then read. It really was only what was on page 2 that was of interest to me. So by the fact that I had to accept that my competitor was doing something better than me, means that it was unbiased. That I really looked at this as scientifically as I could and said, this is best practices. This is what I should teach my students. And so it is not universal by any means. In fact, I'd say it's probably not the norm. It is the best practices by my opinion, but it's not the norm yet. But it is best practices. And so I want to teach you best practices, not necessarily all. In some cases, I'm teaching you the norms of the business, because things that if you don't do it this way, they're going to look at you like you're crazy, okay, or they're going to act like you must have come from some really bad university or whatever. But in other cases, and again, in this case, if a newspaper doesn't use this practice, you might bring it up, or maybe you wait until you become, they accept you as a professional, and then you bring up this best practices. For a long time, I was just using basically what I would call the slug on the jump page. That's it. So the slug now is in the jump line. That's what ties this page to page 1, is the jump line says here, hiking continues from page 1. Hiking in single quote marks on page 1 says hiking continues on page 2. This is what ties the two stories. So the headline doesn't tie them together anymore. It's the jump line that ties them together, that slug in the jump line, hiking in this case. I used to just make that my headline. Basically, I would choose an obvious word or two and put that on as the headline on page 2, and that would be, that would just help them find the jump, and that would be it. But that I do not consider best practices anymore. So anyway, the other thing I guess I would point out here on page 2 is, as I said, I went with 4 stories. Some newspapers like to go in the order that they were on page 1, and there is a logic to that. In other words, the jump for the top story would be at the top of page 2. The jump for the second story would be the next. But that, in this case, demonstrates why that doesn't make sense. Because my top story is at the very bottom here, and then there's hardly any text to it. There's hardly anything here. So how can I design a decent-looking page 2 and use this as my top story? I can't do it. I would have a really upside-down, crazy-looking page 2 if I tried to use this jump on the top of the page. Now, it would be possible, perhaps, to make it one column and then put another jump beside it that would dominate the page, but this would still be at the top of the page. And so that might be a middle ground to try to get the top story, but it's just, the top stories are, I'm most likely to put more of the top stories on page 1, and therefore I'm very likely on a very, almost universally have less jump for the top stories than I do for the bottom stories of page 1. And so it just, so my way of organizing page 2 is by how much text there is. And also, if there's a good picture, I want to use a picture. This is not a particularly good picture. We'll talk about that in a second. But this had a lot of text. This one up here had a little more text, so I put the hiker story at the very top, which was the very bottom of page 1. But I had another fairly decent photo. I had a lot of story, so I decided I would dominate the page, organize the page in a more pleasing way if I put that at the top. I decided I had quite a bit of text for the second story, for the football story. And so even though the picture wasn't great, I decided, well, I'll go ahead and do that stare at the camera picture. I don't like that kind of picture, but I want to go ahead and put a second picture on page 2 to make it look nice. And this is the second longest story, so I will use this picture. And then the other ones I didn't bother to put pictures on. I might, if I'd had more time, I might have organized the page better. As you see on page 2, I just stopped. Every story is rectangular, is modular, but I did not try to make the entire package modular in this case, and I'm not asking you to. So I want you to go, your only requirement is to jump one story. So basically, if you did what I did with one story up top, however, your related requirement is that if you're not going to jump it, you cut it at an appropriate place on page 1. So you are responsible for ending at the end of a sentence, for example, on page 1, and that it makes some sense where you stopped. If you have to pull some information out of that jump and out of that extra text, again, one reason why I put the text box out in the pasteboard, so I can see what's left on the story, so I can make sure that I'm ending this. If I'm going to cut the story, that I'm cutting it at a good place, and I'm not leaving out something important. And so, if you're going to cut all your stories but one, that's fine. You're allowed to do that, but it certainly has to be at the end of a sentence, and you have to have enough on page 1 that makes some sense that you could stop at that point. So. Otherwise, I would suggest you jump more than one story. If you didn't have enough space on page 1 to make sense out of the story, then you better jump it, even if you have to end up jumping 2 stories instead of 1, or however many you needed to. In my case, I jumped 4 of them. Again, partly just so I demonstrate to you 4 times how to jump the story. And so I just try to make a point out of that. Back on page 1 again, let me go up here, one last point with page 1. Actually 2 points here. First off, when I went back on the second day, I realized I had made some mistakes in my headlines. So I would suggest you step aside from when you think you're done, that you step aside from it and come back a little later and try to read it like if you were not the writer, the editor of it, and catch the mistakes you might have made, especially with headlines. My job at the Daily, part of my job was to be the late night editor, which I was the last editor out the door. And that was the main thing I would do, is check headlines. Make sure that no headline had typos in it, had, whatever. Left out words that the person thought he typed in and didn't type in, and, that was grammatically correct and so forth. And I found myself having done one too quickly. It was this one down here. I had rewritten the headline, and so I'd left, it wasn't this headline before, it was different, but I'd left a 2 out of it, and so it made no sense. But in my rewriting the headline a couple of times to make it fit, I had cut out a word that I needed. And so I ended up totally rewriting this headline, I think yesterday morning or whenever I finalized it, when I caught my error. And that, by the way, illustrated my point with changing page 2 or linking the text boxes together, because as I redid this headline, the headline ended up being a little bit bigger in type size, and it pushed some of page 1 text onto page 2. So I had to adapt my jump as well, which is, again, why you link your pages, so that this will be done fairly automatically. The jump of, the movement of some text from page 1 to page 2 is done automatically. However, be aware of that. You need to go double check on page 2 that you didn't do something that then you have some missing text at the end of your story on page 2. The other thing I noticed when I came back to look at it again was that I did not change. I left it as a good, bad example, so to speak, is I would deduct points off of this headline if I were grading myself. Why would I deduct points off of this headline, or the headline and subheadline? You want to tell me? Basically, the headline and the main and the subheadline say the same thing. There's almost no difference. The essence of the headline and subheadline are the same. Therefore, the subheadline's not. There's no reason to write the subheadline if I'm not going to make it different. So I would deduct points on this. The subhead, one of them has to be rewritten or deleted, as the case might be. But they're too much to say. So your subheadline has to add something new, or there's no reason to do the subheadline. So I would deduct points on that. The other thing that I discovered as I looked at it on the second day, I originally had this half-column mug of this runner down here at the bottom over, I think, like in this third column, the right side of this third column, I believe. And that, there were too many photos on the right side. Even though the major photo, the center of focus, is on the left side, by having Murat, this runner, over on the right side also, that meant there were 4 photos on the right and 1 on the left. It just made it off balance to the right. It's still a little bit maybe off balance to the right a little bit, but I moved Murat, the runner, over as far to the left as I could to try to balance the page. Obviously, this is also more than a golden triangle. There's 5 photos on this page instead of 3. In a tabloid, probably the most you can ever get is 3, just because a tabloid is half the size of a broadsheet. But on the broadsheet, you will probably find that you can put more photos. And most newspapers do end up with more than just a golden triangle on a broadsheet nowadays. Sometimes they overdo it. They have so many little pull-out quotes and little reference boxes and and so many little things all over the place that it actually makes you almost dizzy looking at the page. I don't think this makes it dizzy. I think it's okay. It is, the other thing is when Murat was over to the right, then this whole area was overly gray. And so by bringing him over, we have less grayness on the left side. So it's a little more balanced, a little bit less gray in this accumulated area in here. And these things are important as designers to think about. Your balance, whether you have excessive gray in one area, and so forth. Any questions on any of that? So that is all explained in part 2 of my demonstration. I would encourage you again to probably you should watch if you have any questions on how to handle the jump page especially, I would watch that second video, the part 2 of my demonstration and do it and completing this assignment. Because basically I'm showing you exactly what to do step by step in doing this and demonstrating this to you. One thing that we will find a challenge, it'll be interesting when we go to your second assignment, your second design assignment, is now then you'll have 2 tabloid pages. Your 2 tabloid pages are in essence about the same amount of space as one broadsheet page. Maybe a little bit more because I made this broadsheet page a little bit narrower, so it's not quite double the size of the tabloid that we're going to use. But now, when we go to tabloid, in one way it's going to be easier in that you've already looked at headlines, you've already done editing, you've already looked at your photos and everything, but you're actually going to have less space. In completing 2 full pages of tabloid, you're going to have less space than one broadsheet and whatever you're jumping on page 2. So now you're going to have to redesign, consider, you'll probably have to use fewer photos just because it won't fit. And so even though it'll be easier in the sense, if you do a good job in this assignment, your next 2 assignments will be a lot easier because you've already done so much work on them. But it will not be without its challenges because it's totally different when you go to that new format and you'll have overall less space to work with. So you have to do some more cutting of content or something. Even if your assignment will be to fill up page 2. As I said, 2 pages of tabloid equals 1 page of broadsheet. So the fact that you're jumping even 1 story means you have too much content to make into two tabloid pages. Okay, well, I will stop there. You have about 40 minutes or so to work on your assignments. You can gather as teams again and work on editing or whatever you want to do. Again, the teams, this is an individual assignment in the sense of your design, your headlining, your captions and stuff like that. You should already have captions, but you're responsible to make sure they read correctly. Just because somebody else wrote a caption doesn't alleviate your responsibility as the editor, because I can guarantee that that a lot of people don't write their captions very well, and so you need to make sure that they're in good standing. Somebody asked me the other day if they feel like a story needs to be totally, massively rewritten, a new lead, so forth. Can they do that? And I kind of shook my head. Yes, absolutely. You are the editor. You are the copy editor. You are the owner of this story, the stories now. You can do anything to the stories you want to. And so if you feel compelled to rewrite somebody else's story, go for it. I'm going to tell you this. I probably am not going to look at editing as much with this assignment as I will a tabloid. Because this assignment, you have so much to do with headlining and designing and stuff. I'm going to probably focus on that and not too much on the editing with this assignment, because then you're going to do the tabloid, and so by then you have plenty of time to do editing. So I wouldn't worry as much about editing. If you run out of time, don't worry as much about that, although you can take even though you can't access Quark from China or wherever you might be going during the break, you can take your stories with you. If you don't have it Word, you can change, there's a freeware called OpenOffice that will import Word documents and allow you to edit Word documents. Or you can even transform it into RTF, which essentially is a common basis for all word processing nowadays. So you can take your stories with you and finish your editing during your break if you need to. That much you can do. Now, when you get back, let me explain. The deadline for this assignment will be the night of the second Monday you're here. In other words, you get back on a Monday. It's the following Monday that it's due, and it's at like midnight. I think it's midnight. I set it for on that Monday, or about that time, really late anyway. So you have quite a bit of time to work on it. I did this, and while explaining it all and trying to demonstrate it all and doing extra jumps and everything, it probably did take me 3 hours. But if I hadn't been having to explain it to everybody, I could have done it shorter. But it might have still taken me 2 hours to do 2 pages. But what's that mean? That means, yeah, it might take you 4 hours. It might even take you 6 hours. I don't know. You should be able to get it done when you get back. If you haven't touched it, the design, if you have the stories ready, you know what the photos are, you decide which are the best photos, you maybe even can think about headlining, since that's 25% of your grade. You can do some stuff while you're gone, and when you get back, like I say, you need 4 hours or so to actually do the desktop publishing, even if you don't do anything this week. We've asked permission to have some of our open labs in 105, right next door here, but we don't have approval yet. If you have not gotten a copy of Quark to put on your own laptop, I recommend that you do that. I did all my demonstration on a laptop. It's better to have a bigger screen. You can see it a little better, do your work a little better on a bigger screen with a desktop computer. But it's certainly doable with your laptop, as I demonstrated. At the daily paper I was at, we had screens about twice as big as our screens in here, and our monitors here in this room, really big monitors, probably more than twice this size. And that's in a professional setting. That's certainly nice to have really big monitors on which to do your desktop publishing. But it can be done without that. So I think Faiza is going to come here at 11. If she's not here, if you haven't gotten a copy of Quark on your computer, I suggest you make arrangements to do that. Again, you can't use it off of campus because it's tied to our main copy of the program on our server. So once you leave campus or thereabouts, you'll lose. Once you get out of the range of our Wi-Fi, in essence, you don't have access to Quark anymore. But when you're here, obviously, you'll have much more than 4 hours to do your work if you have it on your laptop, so you can do it in your apartment or wherever you want to do it at. Otherwise, let me know if you need. Let me know early in the week if you think you're going to need some time in a lab, and I'll do everything. Even if I have to come sit in the lab and oversee it myself, I will arrange time. But I can't do it in one day. Probably it'll probably take me a couple of days to make arrangements. So let me know earlier in the week if you are looking at your schedule and saying, I've got a problem here. Maybe what I might try to do is get permission to open up 105, since most of you are more comfortable with Windows, I believe, to open 105. And as far as that goes, I could open 104 too, for those who want to use Apple. I could open both rooms and walk back and forth on Saturday, a week from, the week after almost a week after you get here. On the Saturday after you're here, I could probably arrange to man the labs, both labs, if necessary, to provide you time. But I need to know that you need that. Otherwise, like I say, I won't make arrangements unless somebody tells me they need it. So please let me know if you feel like you need some more lab time. I will do what's necessary to make sure you have lab time, so that's not an excuse, okay? Okay, so again, you can work on your own, you can work with your teams, whatever you want to do. The teams basically, again, are working on the stories. That's their primary, where you can help each other mostly with that. The other stuff you should be doing on your own, basically. Okay. Thank you.